That was such an amazing introduction from Dr. Schmitz. We were listening to it backstage, and what really stood out for me was his words that it is the right investments that can secure our food future forever. And it's just the perfect introduction for what he referred to as crop diversity heroes, Dr. Cary Fowler and Dr. Geoffrey Hawtin. Thank you so much. It's my great honor as a food and climate journalist to be on this stage. One of the greatest honors of my career, to be able to interview both of you. And before I begin, I just want to quickly reflect on some teachings, basically, that I learned yesterday through the sessions that really made me think of the two of you. When Mashal Hussein was on the stage, she referred to seeds as hope. And I think that's what you've given to us by preserving the world's heritage seeds. You're giving us hope for the future. Something else that I learned yesterday was something that you said, Cary. You were talking about Norman Borlaug's boldness and his urgency around being bold about change. And what could be more bold than going to a country and asking them to use some land to build a vault for the end of days? That's pretty bold, I think. And then something else that really came out for me yesterday, I've had the great honor to interview and speak with several World Food Prize laureates. And aside from all the various backgrounds that you all have, one thing that I've noticed is a common trait is humility. And I just, wonder, like, for people who have so many achievements under their belt, how could you be so humble? And the only solution or the only answer I could come to was that you have dedicated your life to something so much bigger than yourselves, and that's why you're so humble. So before I start the questions, I just wanted to applaud you for bringing us hope, for your boldness and courage, and for your humility. So thank you. And now we're going to draw on your wisdom. So the exciting part that everybody's here for, live with the laureates. And my first question is for you, Jeff. Going behind the scenes 20 years ago, what were some key moments in the seed preservation movement that really stood out for you and solidified your vision for what you wanted to see in the future around crop biodiversity?
Well, if you think about the key moments in the history of plant genetic resources, you really have to go back to at least Vavilov and his work in the 1930s, collecting plants particularly in the areas where plants were originally domesticated and where there's still a lot of genetic diversity. You could go back earlier than that. You could go back to Darwin and Mendel and many others. But I think the genetic resources movement generally recognizes Vavilov as its father. One of the first, landmark occasions that had some influence on me was actually in 1983, when the International Undertaking on Plant Genetic Resources was signed. Now, this was a treaty. It was non-binding, but it was essentially a declaration that plant genetic resources are a common good, a public good that they would be used for the use of humanity and made freely available. Throughout the 80s, things got politicized quite highly, and particularly looking at the whole issue of bioprospecting for plants, for medical plants and so on. This resulted in the Convention on Biological Diversity in, I think it was 1984. It affected very much the agricultural gene banks, the gene banks of the CGIR, which hold some almost 800,000 accessions, some of the largest and most used in the world, came under a lot of fire. There were accusations that these were gene banks, this material was being held on behalf of the multinational companies who wanted to patent it and so on, and things got very political. So in 1993, the centers signed agreements declaring, no, this material was public material, and they were just trustees of this material on behalf of the global community. And that to me was quite a landmark because it really established that this is a public good. This is some of the most important materials. Then on from that, this was then recognized the importance of multilateral approaches rather than just bilateral agreements as under the convention. In the next milestone, which to me was the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, which came into force in 2024, but recognized that everybody had an interest in these. It was a huge interdependence for the material, and it set out the rules by which countries, individuals, institutions could access material, and it laid out the basis on which they would have to share any benefits arising from the use of that material. Then following on from that was the establishment of the Crop Trust in 2004, which was only possible because of the treaty, and after that, I guess, 2008, the establishment of Svalbard. So there's been a progression, and I think where we are today, you can trace back for decades anyway.
Amazing, amazing. Cary, you and I met in March when I interviewed you for an article on the vision for adapted crops and soils. And at the time, you told me that it was your feeling that the supply approach to changing food systems, it wasn't working. And something you said to me really stuck out. And I quote, you said to me, "I think we are all beginning to realize that the challenge is not just about filling people's bellies. It is about providing good nutrition. That's what a food system ought to do. It ought to be based on nutrition, and you should really be working your way backwards to figure out what kind of agricultural system do we need to accomplish that." How does this statement connect with crop biodiversity?
Well, you know, I'll connect it with something that Geoff just said that really struck me. And Geoff mentioned Vavilov, the great Russian scientist who was really, in a way, the founder of our field. And there's a story about what happened at the Vavilov Institute in Leningrad during the siege of Leningrad in World War II. Maybe some of you know that, but this was really the first gene bank in the world. It was assembled with collections all over the world for the purpose of supplying plant breeders. The Nazis surrounded Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, for 900 days. Hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation. And here's the point. There were people in that seed bank who were students of Vavilov. He had been arrested by the government. There were people in that seed bank who died of starvation rather than eat the seeds that they had in the seed bank. So there were more than a dozen people. The curator of the rice collection died of starvation sitting at his desk with bags of rice on the desk. And I've always thought that, my gosh, you know, we're not called upon to give our lives for this issue. So the least we can do is to conserve this diversity. And it's the diversity of not just of rice, but of all the other crops. And I think where we have to go now is to think of what we're doing is not simply taking care of the production demands of the major staple crops, but we have to look at addressing issues such as childhood stunting, which are not issues of calorie intake, but are really issues of dietary deficiencies. And that requires us, particularly in an age of climate change, to conserve this diversity of crops and the diversity within crops so that we have options for the future to build that kind of nutrition security that the world needs.
Amazing. So I'm hearing it's not about quantity, it's not just about calories, it's about quality of the food that we eat. Also coming back to a previous article, Geoff, you recently published a piece in DevX with Dr. Schmitz in which you talk about seeds and how they, at least in part, hold the solution for issues like climate change, food insecurity, loss of crop biodiversity. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, happily. I think Stefan mentioned this in his introduction as well, that really crop diversity enables us to produce, enables agriculture to adapt to new situations. So with climate change, we know that we're going to need crops that are adapted to, say, higher temperatures, to drought, to waterlogging in some cases, to much more extreme weather conditions, to a whole changing spectrum of pests and diseases. And we're going to have to produce crops that can grow under those radically different conditions, and the conditions that will continue to evolve over the next century and more, and possibly continuing. How can you do that without the diversity that you need as plant breeders to come up with the drought resistance and cold tolerance and all the other disease, all the other factors? So, going back to where I started my career in plant breeding and setting up a new program, the first thing I had to do was create collections of materials in order to find the variability I needed to breed varieties. So it's only part of the solution. Obviously, in feeding a world of 2 billion more people than today under those conditions is going to require a massive effort, of which genetic diversity and plant breeding is only part of the solution. But it's a part of the solution that I think is vital, even under, let's say, if one develops new agronomic practices to address some of these things. One will need varieties that are adapted to those particular new agronomic practices. The old varieties may or may not be suitable. So as over the next coming years, the crop diversity, that basis, will underpin our whole ability to be able to adapt agriculture to these changing circumstances.
It's just so fascinating. I think everything you're saying kind of underscores what was said yesterday about seeds offering so much hope. We are nothing without those seeds, so you've given us so much by creating this vault. My next question is actually to you again, Jeff. With 90% of the genetic diversity of our major crops already lost, what are some of the actions and innovations that can help to prevent this from continuing, this degeneration? And also, what is the role of farmers and communities in helping to preserve crop biodiversity?
I would question first that figure of 90% of genetic loss. We don't really know what that figure is. We know that a very high percentage, between 70 and 90% of the varieties growing today, we're growing, say, 50 to 100 years ago, are not found on farmers' fields today. What that means in the loss of genetic diversity, of course, is different, because new varieties have replaced the old ones, and many of the genes will have been transferred through and the traits. But we do know that there has been a very substantial loss of traits, absolutely. But that figure of 90% is, I think, not necessarily totally accurate. But what can we do about it? Well, what farmers have done traditionally for generations is just carry on growing their varieties. They're often giving them up because new varieties come along and replace them, better varieties from their point of view, higher yielding, perhaps pest-resistant, disease-resistant, shorter cooking time, perhaps. But in a lot of cases, farmers will hang on to small samples of their old crops. Very often, there have been some very interesting studies where farmers have introduced new varieties, not by necessarily replacing the old ones, but putting the new one as part of a mixture of varieties. So there are things that can happen at the farm level that can be encouraged in order to maintain the diversity. But that's not really going to be enough. We know that diversity is still being lost. So the big movement really has been to create gene banks for collecting this material. But these can operate at many different levels and should do in order to have an effective system globally. We can't just rely on international gene banks of the consultative group, for example, that I mentioned earlier, although they are critically important and hold a vast amount of genetic diversity. But that diversity needs to get out. It needs to get out to breeders at the international, the national, farmers and seed companies, and so on. And that can only work if you've got a network of different institutions operating at different levels with complementary approaches and complementary ways of working. So You can imagine a situation where material is being conserved by farmers. A national gene bank will conserve that as part of a national effort, along with all the information that goes with that, often held in local languages, which is why the local aspect is so important. And then you've got, that will then be duplicated. A lot of that, the most important examples, will be due at the international level, which is the best way for ensuring material can flow between countries. And we know there's a huge interdependence among countries. Something like 70% on average, 70% of the crops grown on farmers' fields are originated in a different part of the world, 70%, and that's the average across the whole world. So there's a huge interdependence, and so the international component of this is extremely vital, because it's only by, and things like the international treaty I referred to earlier, that allows for the movement of this material. Can that material be used? And only if it's used is it worth conserving.
Oh. So what I'm hearing is partnership, and I'm also hearing the key theme of this event, which is cultivating diplomacy, which comes out through the international connections. My next question's for you, Cary. It's something that's very close to your heart, I know, which is the role of crop biodiversity in benefiting vulnerable people, and particularly women. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, in my limited time at the State Department, I've been there for 3 years, the question that I encountered on day one was, well, what to do with this opportunity of being special envoy. And what we have done is to promote a program, an initiative called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, which seeks to deal with really the fundamentals of food security and nutrition security in Africa, which is how do we produce better, healthier, more fertile soils and crops that are adapted to climate or whatever, and crops that can also nourish the soils just as the soils nourish the crops. To me, I've always tried to keep things simple, and it seemed like moving in this direction was, in a way, like following the Hippocratic Oath that medical doctors take here in the United States of first do no harm. So going along with that, first do no harm, well, let's build up the soils and let's help adapt the crops to climate change and such. We've focused on traditional and indigenous crops. And I must say that I could give you a lot of intellectual reasons of why that's important to do that, but what really nourishes me about that approach is that most of those traditional and indigenous crops in Africa are tended by women. We know that women domesticated most of our crops historically back in the Neolithic, but today most of those highly nutritious what we call opportunity crops in Africa are tended by women. So if you want to empower women, which I want to do, and you want to address very directly the problem of childhood stunting, which also very much pulls at my heart, then I think a good way to do that is empower the crops that empower the women who feed the children. And that's what we've tried to do.
And circling back to Jeff's references to the international community and fostering diplomacy, I recall some time back you had mentioned that this work that you both did around the Global Seed Vault, it was one of the only experiences you had really seen where countries that might not typically get along, they all came together as one towards a positive and a peaceful goal. What does that say about the connection between the Global Seed Vault and peace?
So
that's for you.
For me?
Yes.
Well, you know, I've spent a lot of time in that tunnel and inside the seed vault in Svalbard. And I've had a couple of experiences with people down there. If you take people into the room, it's at minus 18 Celsius, and it's really a pretty simple room. It looks like a warehouse almost. It has shelves, and there are boxes on the shelves, and they sometimes have their colorful flags on them from the countries they're coming from. You walk down the aisle, and yeah, you do see on one aisle a maroon-colored wooden box, very hefty, coming from North Korea. And then around the corner, I could take you there now, is a box of seeds from South Korea. And there's seeds from Russia, and there's seeds from Ukraine. And it's an amazing thing to see that all those seeds are just getting along with each other, doing fine. And the other part of that experience, though, is to understand that you're walking into a room that is probably the biggest collection of living biodiversity on Earth. It's our history. It's our common history, because all of these crops co-evolved with us, and we selected for that diversity. It's a library of life. So one experience I've had, and it I think relates back to your question, is that I've taken some groups of people down there, some famous people, Jimmy Carter and others, and a number of journalists. And you walk down the long tunnel, about 130-meter long tunnel, before you get to this vault room that you can see is real cold because it's got ice crystals on the door. And there's always a lot of excitement and talking as we walk down the tunnel. And then people they walk through the shelves of seeds. You can't do that anymore because the seed vault's not open to the public or anything. But they walk through all these shelves of seeds, and they see all the countries they're coming from. And what happens that I find interesting is what happens when people leave that little room and start to walk out the tunnel. They can be very animated and talking a lot as they go down the tunnel to the room, but once they've gone in that room and seen all those boxes with all those seeds and realized that diversity is not just the history of agriculture, living history of agriculture, but it's also the future of agriculture. It's all the options that we have for the future of agriculture. When people leave the room and walk out, they're silent. There's no talking. And I've seen many people with tears. I think if other people could have that experience, to realize that we really are in this together, and that this diversity is most profoundly a common heritage of mankind, which means that we have a common responsibility towards it, we would be taking a step or two more towards a peaceful world, I would hope.
That's so moving. I know I haven't been there, but I did watch a documentary that depicted exactly what you said, where these boxes from countries that typically wouldn't be next to each other. It was so moving and so symbolic, absolutely.
And by the way, let's give a lot of credit to the government and people of Norway for allowing this to happen, for managing it, and for making it successful, and for financing it.
Yeah. I remember we were having a conversation the other day, and you said if there was a country that deserved the World Food Prize this year, it would be Norway.
Absolutely.
Jeff, on the same theme around peace, and I'm going to kind of take it to the other side and talk about conflict and war, which is obviously a big issue in the world right now. What is the intersection between biodiversity loss and conflict or war, and how can we use improving biodiversity to mitigate against these risks of conflict?
Sure. Maybe just to give an example of how war affects things. When I started my career as a plant breeder, I was based in Lebanon. I was working on a program that essentially covered a region going from Morocco to Pakistan and from Turkey to Ethiopia. Now, to start that program, we needed to do a lot of plant collecting seeds from that whole region. So I spent a lot of time out with the team collecting in places like the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, in desert margins in Iraq, in parts of Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Ethiopia. And we collected this incredibly valuable set of material that when we held it in Lebanon, when the civil war broke out, we wanted to save that collection, realizing just how valuable it was. So we moved it under quite difficult conditions to Syria. I think we moved it something like 6 times. We're talking here some 30,000 different seed packets between Lebanon and Syria. Finally, it ended up in Aleppo. And that formed part of what became one of the largest collections anywhere in the world of international credit, about 140,000 different accessions of wheat, of barley, of chickpeas, of lentils, of many crops, held in the gene bank in Aleppo. When the civil war broke out, or the conflict in Syria, for a long time, the locals around the bank held out and they protected it. But finally, they could protect it no longer, and it was looted, and that material was lost. Fortunately, almost all that material was in Svalbard and have been duplicated, which I think is remarkable. And it has then been returned, the large part of it there to Morocco, and some to Lebanon for regeneration, for using as a basis for continuing plant breeding. And I saw some of that material earlier this year in Morocco growing out, and some of that material had been collected 50 years before. But if you wanted to collect that material again now, if it still exists, I don't think anyone would be collecting in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan at the moment. Plant collecting expeditions to Iraq are probably not advisable. And so, conflict or if that stuff hadn't been saved, it could well have been lost forever. And this is some extremely important material. This is material that's collected in the same region where most of it was originally domesticated, where there was still a huge amount of genetic variability from the varieties that farmers had bred and developed and so on over thousands of years. And so I think to me that shows that the importance of collecting, the importance of maintaining this material, it could so easily have been lost, and also the importance, of course, of Svalbard as a backup.
Yeah.
Amazing. I actually, in a conversation a few months ago, I was interviewing someone, and he said that there are 3 parties to a war: the 2 parties that are fighting and the soil. And I thought that was so profound, the connection between the biodiversity and war and peace. My next question, I feel like this is a hard question, but I feel like you can handle it. I'm going to put out a hypothetical situation to you, Cary. Let's say that we arrive at this doomsday, this hypothetical doomsday, and the earth is bare. We've lost our seeds, but we have the global seed vault. And you've been tasked with the opportunity to do things over. Mm-hmm. What would you do? How would you do things differently from how they've been done over these years?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying that when we were proposing and planning the seed vault, we never thought of it as a doomsday vault. Never used that word. It occurred in the headline of a magazine article, and then, wow, did I understand that the media would get interested. We got a lot of calls then. And we had people would write me, email me, and sometimes even phone me or accost me at meetings and say, well, what a stupid idea this was, because if there's doomsday, how are we going to find our way to Svalbard to get the seeds? And after I've been asked that question about 10 times, I said, don't worry, we'll bring them to you. And so, you know, what we really were planning for was for the kind of doomsday that occurs almost every day, I'm sorry to say, where we lose diversity in the field, or we lose it in another seed bank around the world. And we've successfully done that. I think there are more than 1,300,000 samples in Svalbard now. And by the way, you know, there have been years when the airlines have lost my luggage more than once. I travel a lot. And we haven't lost a single package of seeds going to Svalbard. I don't know how that happens. There are a few things that we'd do differently. Absolutely. I spent a lot of time working with the planners, the architects, even the construction workers. But bear in mind, you know, nobody had ever actually built a seed vault in the middle of a mountain before. And one of the problems with doing that is, once you start tunneling in the mountain, you can't see what's around you. You only see the sides of that you've tunneled out. So, you know, this gets into the weeds, but it's a tiny little thing that, of course, I remember. When you start to tunnel in a mountain, you follow the rock seam for stability purposes. And you hope that the rock seam is going up, so that if there's any moisture in the seed vault, it drains out. The rock seam went down. And we didn't think that climate change would progress quite as fast as it did. So we didn't, in the beginning, think that, and these were the projections back in those days, that the permafrost would be destroyed above the seed vault. It was. Some water came into the tunnel, never made it to the seed vault room. And by the way, you know, if a drop of water ever gets into a room that's at -18, guess what happens? It freezes. So but if you go into the media, and this was the other thing I learned, if you go all the way to the top of the world and you build a tunnel into a mountain to put seeds in there, and the general public can't just go in and walk around and take a look at it, you will be generating a lot of conspiracy theories. You know, what is really going on there?
Oh, wow.
And, you know, I remember some of there are ones, you can check them out. I don't advise it on the internet, saying there was a flood in the seed vault. No, there was never a flood in the seed vault. And guess what? At -18, there's never going to be a flood in the seed vault. But you can read about it from people who've never set foot on Svalbard. You can also see that it's a secret NATO facility. And since I've spent many, many days down there and know that there's no toilet or running water down there, I thought that the conspiracy theory that it was a secret NATO facility and somehow we were going to put the population of Norway in there, do something bad to the world, and then repopulate from the seed vault was something I would rather take my chances on the outside rather than be on the inside. So what did I learn? I learned that you have to be careful about how you communicate. You have to over-communicate and try to really be transparent. We did have to go, I had to go and talk to every depositing institution that put seeds in the seed vault had to have a separate conversation. And by the way, you know, in those days, that was, you know, you call up a manager of a seed bank in some country and you say, I want to talk to you about sending a duplicate copy of your seeds to put them in a mountain up near the North Pole. You know, 20 years ago, that was a pretty crazy thing. That's a crazy way to start a conversation. So we had to go through that, and I think they were just growing pains. We learned along the way. There are some things I'd do differently, but at the end of the day, we've got 1,300,000 samples, 300,000 samples there, and honestly, when it first started, people would ask me, how many samples do you need to have in the seed vault for you personally to consider it a success? And I always avoided that question. because I didn't want to set the bar anywhere. I will tell you that honestly, in those days when the seed vault opened, I thought if we can get 300,000 samples of crop diversity, and it's been worth it. And now we have 1,300,000. So
it's amazing, amazing. And I know recently there's obviously been a huge success where there's been a massive deposit, the largest deposit ever to the seed vault, which is
30,000.
So exciting, so exciting. Let me ask a question to both of you, because obviously you're both advocates for gene banks, and we've been hearing since yesterday that gene banks are under great risk and they're underfunded. What would you tell this audience with respect to being advocates themselves and making gene banks an economic priority? And this goes to both of you, so maybe we'll start with Jeff.
Okay, we hear an awful lot about biodiversity loss these days. You talk to anybody and they'll conjure up a picture of whales, pandas, rhinoceroses, charismatic animals, even charismatic plants. But you talk to the average person about agricultural biodiversity and their face goes blank. There's no realization that actually what we're talking about here, the genetic diversity of our crops and their wild relatives, is arguably the most important component of total biodiversity for humanity and for the future of humanity. And so I guess I would say that if somehow we can get across the realization that biodiversity loss includes this incredible wealth, this incredibly important subset on which our future depends, I think we will have achieved a lot, and perhaps building on that realization that one, at the moment, if a government gives money to a gene bank, there's very little political capital in that. There's not a groundswell of support and applause from the general public if they do so. If it becomes seen as part of the biodiversity loss in general, and perhaps arguably one of the most important components of biodiversity loss in general, that situation might be different. And then I think we might begin to see the resources that we need in order to make sure this material is conserved and used. Let's see that money also going into particularly developing country plant breeding programs and for their ability to use that material, because without that, as I say, there's no point in conserving it.
Well, you know, we've talked a lot about this Svalbard Global Seed Vault. We have to realize that facility is a duplicate copy of what's in national gene banks and private collections and NGO collections and such. So both collections are important. Yes, it's important that we conserve what's in the seed vault. It's also important that we conserve and use what's in the national collections. I don't know of a single national gene bank that operates on a secure multi-year budget. Not a single one. And I always tell people that if you want to conserve this diversity, which is the biological foundation of agriculture, you want to do it 50 out of 50 years, not 49 out of 50. That's not quite good enough. So what can people do? I don't want to get into the political business, but I'm prohibited from doing that. But I will say that you know, our elected representatives all over the world hear from their constituents on whatever the most hot button issue is of the day. They never hear about this. So if you're, I suppose, sitting in the office of a member of parliament or congressional representative or whatever, you've probably got a file folder in your email that's labeled with one of those hot button issues, and you just shunt all of the emails that are coming in about that into that folder. It gets attention when somebody writes in to say, how's our national gene bank doing? Do we have enough money to grow out the seed samples so that they don't die in storage? Do we have enough to collect and do this over time? So I think that we underestimate what power we all have to start conversations and to inform our governments about what's really important. And I think on this issue, Simple communications go a long way because they're frankly not expecting it.
We have 10 seconds left, and I would just like for us to leave everybody with something to walk away with in terms of a long-term vision from this event. If you can each maybe make a 20-second statement, what people should walk away with. Now, starting now.
God, yeah.
Jeff.
That's a very tall ask. This is the elevator speech where you have a chance for a pitch. I guess the takeaway for me is that this diversity exists. It's incredibly important. Very few people really realize that and realize its importance. But if we don't conserve it, then what we're doing is limiting our options for our children and our grandchildren.
Amazing.
I'll just agree with that.
Thank you both so much. It's been just so amazing learning from you, and also just being a bystander of the amazing energy between the two of you. When we were backstage, they were laughing together back there, and it's just a pleasure and an honor to be in your presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you.